Hello and welcome to Media7. In this week's program, we'll look at coverage of the emissions trading scheme. Does anyone really understand it? We'll ask how the media treats women in politics, and I'll talk to Phil Smith, whose Great Southern Film and Television Company seems to be everywhere you might care to look at the moment. But first, it's the ETS. Jose Barbosa goes counting smokestacks.
If you visit American City, you will find it very pretty. Just two things of which you must beware. Don't drink the water and don't breathe the air.
If it was true then, it's even more so now. Switch on the telly or computer over the past few weeks and you could be forgiven for thinking you stumbled across the 24-hour smokestack channel.
Whoa, look at those vents. Me, there's 4 of them.
In fact, steer long enough and a secret code starts to appear. 1 smokestack for a story on emissions, 2+ big red arrows to show just how much God hates us, and this to indicate a Godzilla-style battle between a giant John Key and the smog monster. Which is strangely close to reality because under international obligations, New Zealand's required to cut emissions in an effort to halt climate change. So we all don't end up like this.
Each survivable contains all the tools you need to enjoy a safe and happy stay on our changing planet.
Hence the emissions trading scheme, which places a limit on the amount of CO2 companies are allowed to emit. If your emissions go above that, you're punished by being forced to buy credits from cleaner companies. All simple enough, but since the national government presented its version of the scheme, the media's focused on the political horse trading, which has seen the main players confused.
An increase in the benefit just over this period. No rise for beneficiaries, yeah. Well, we thought there was.
Bummed out.
They have broken that faith.
And sharing the screen with a cow. So how good a job have the media done explaining this tricky issue?
Did you know that?
No, I didn't, I must say, I didn't know. But thank you very much for your time.
And if the politicians and their sidekicks don't know what's going on?
Well, as I say, as a lowly backbencher, I don't have the details.
What hope do the rest of us have?
Jose Barbosa there. With me now is a journalist who has written with both clarity and detail about what the ETS is and what it means, business-wise, Patrick Smelly. And the chair of the Sustainability Council, Simon Terry. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. Now, Patrick, your major point since the ETS deal was announced seems to have been that it stinks because it allows major emitters to merrily carry on emitting and we, the taxpayers, stump up for the carbon credits to cover them. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary. I think what really irks me is the fact that the emissions trading scheme is supposed to change the way that we all behave as human beings as we face the threat of climate change. And the place to start to do that is on the source of emission. Instead, we're smearing this obligation across the population, and I think what people are only just waking up to is that there's no way out of this. You can't say we've saved the economy here because the economy has to pay over here. There's no sort of silver bullet for this which makes it easy for us to move on and do something else.
Which was the point made this week by Ewan Mason of Canterbury University, who focused particularly on the forestry side. On the other hand, this week in the Dominion Post, we had Catherine Beard representing those major emitters who described the idea that taxpayers will be forced to subsidise polluters as just sloganeering designed to demonise our largest employers and wealth creators. So there's a battle of ideas going on here. I think people could be forgiven for not knowing what to make of it.
That's nonsense. I mean, the reality is that those large emitting industries, particularly industries like the dairy industry, which do represent our most significant opportunities for economic growth, are also our most significant threats from a climate change perspective. They're the things that we have to take responsibility for. It's not demonising, it's simply saying there's a real problem here which, as humanity, let alone as New Zealand or as New Zealand parliamentarians, we have to deal with.
Do you think there is a PR campaign going on from those major emitters? It's the Greenhouse Policy Coalition, they call themselves.
To be honest with you, Russell, I actually think the Greenhouse Policy Coalition was successful sometime just before the last election when they extracted a variety of behind closed doors promises from National Party politicians that they would get a scheme pretty much like the one they've got now. And I understand the position that people like Nick Smith and John Key find themselves in. You can't screw the economy up completely and hope that everyone will go, thank goodness we're dealing with climate change. They'll say, where's my job? So the balance between environment and economics, I understand that in a political sense. On the other hand, I see the seesaw right down the economic end and not really a hell of a lot going on the environmental end except a lot of gum flapping.
But from what you're saying, I take it that you think the Greenhouse Policy Coalition is focusing more on lobbying government than trying to influence public opinion.
Yes, I suppose that's true.
Yeah, I'm asking because we seem to have seen this in a few science stories lately, the folate and bread story, for example, where there were quite effective low-profile PR campaigns.
Yes. Well, I think the thing that strikes me about climate change is that it's full of threats, which nobody as an individual knows how to do anything real about, apart from, turning off the lights or, flushing the toilet a bit less or something. Basically, it's one of those classic things where you've got a huge catastrophic risk, which no one can quite tell you exactly where the risk is going to end up. Is it going to be as bad as people say, or is it actually just going to be, quite pleasant in Northland from now on, or something? And because of that, because the risk is catastrophic, and people don't know what to do about it, they feel powerless, they feel angry, and they also really react by turning off when they see dueling experts. So when you see Greenhouse Policy Coalition arguing, say, with Simon, what tends to happen is people go, oh, I don't know. Just tell me what I have to do.
And Simon, I have to say you had a very forthright column in the New Zealand Herald this week, the gist of which, correct me if I'm wrong, seemed to be that the government is spinning this policy pretty hard.
What they're proposing is that the forest credits, those credits we earn from the United Nations because we have forests that were planted in time to actually absorb carbon, that the government somehow has those costlessly available to it. Those credits are valuable because the foresters have generated the carbon savings. But if we don't pay the foresters, they then are expropriated. The government's not saying they're doing that. It means we ultimately have to pay the foresters some time. Those credits therefore have real value. They're going to cost somebody. At the moment, the government's saying, we'll put it on the Visa card, we'll actually let the future generation pay for it. That's both, completely inappropriate, immoral to actually undertake that sort of course of action. But a lot of people don't understand that's the case because the accounts aren't showing that at the moment. And
the alternative would be, I think the credit card metaphor is quite a good one, isn't it? Because the government's using those credits now when it should really be planning to save them for when the current forests are cut down in, what is it, 2020?
In the 2020s, we have a whole crop of forests going to be taken down. If we don't save the credits that we haven't paid the foresters for now, if we don't save them for that date, we have to go out to the international market and buy new credits, and the price of those could be anything up to $100 a tonne. The Treasury is saying it could be an $18 billion bill if we fail to pay for any of these now and use them all up and then face the bill later. So any subsidies that are provided to the major polluters that are currently the big beneficiaries of this scheme, they're going to be paid for by tomorrow's children.
Why has that short-termism not emerged as a story in itself? Because I really don't think it has.
I can't give you an answer as to why that hasn't emerged, although Simon, I think, and others are starting to write about those things. The observation I'd make about what Simon's so lucidly put today is that this has explained for me why the Labour Party's crapping itself about the whole thing. If you imagine they can expect to be out of government for about 6 years, possibly 9, that means that they could reasonably expect to be going back into government around the middle of the next decade, which is around about the time you have to think about what the hell are we going to do about this forest problem. So they're actually looking over their own electoral horizon into a period when they might reasonably expect to be in government and saying this is extremely expensive on the back of growing fiscal deficits, which we know about through to about 2016.
So what you're saying is their objection is not mere politics?
Well, their objection is not mere politics, except to the extent that they have to remain in government during that period. It's very hard for a 3-year electoral cycle to deal with the problem that happens, 12, 13, 14 years hence. And I understand that, but it's interesting to see how politicians who aren't in power now and are thinking, what are we going to do when it's actually our problem, are reacting to the issues.
Do you think there's been too much focus on the politics of this rather than the policy in recent weeks? Because we have heard a lot about the Maori Party. We've heard a lot about whether Phil Goff was done wrong. We haven't heard that much in detail about the policy.
I'd say yes and no. I don't think we've heard nearly enough about the politics of the deal with the Maori Party. I don't think the Maori Party knows what the deal is yet either. We're going to see that haggled out somehow or other in a slightly unparliamentary process around the Select Committee, I suspect. So to that extent, I would like to hear a lot more about what it is the Maori Party expects to get. Having said that, the politics, having a little scrap about a here and now issue is a lot easier to report than the rather imponderable size of the climate change issue in the broad.
It is extraordinarily difficult to get your head around, isn't it? It strikes me that one of the problems is perhaps that you have to have some grasp not only of economics but also of sustainability issues and of politics.
And you have to believe in climate change to think it's worth doing.
Yeah.
The Kyoto Agreement and the ETS are just outright complex. They're horribly complex. A lot of the journalists I speak to are really grappling, to try and find out what is the bottom on this and not having the time to do it. So I think what was actually quite interesting about the political to and froing earlier in the week was that the journalists started to twig, wait a minute, this isn't actually all neat and tidy. And it then opened their eyes a bit to some of the deeper issues. And the deeper issues come right back to this question of who's actually paying at the end of the day and how much is the scheme saving. The government has been economical with what it's put out on the very key numbers that are necessary. It wasn't declared on the first Labour scheme whether the scheme, or how much the scheme was actually going to save in terms of cutting emissions. It turned out it was 1%, which was about in line with what we estimated, but that was months after the scheme was first up. The current government also is not providing an estimate of how much does it actually save. So journalists are not given a lot of information either.
Are you getting a good hearing? Obviously you're coming from a particular direction. I mean, for instance, was it easy enough to get that column placed with the Herald?
There is a shortage of space on columns at the moment. It was quite interesting. It took a few days for that, in fact over a week, to actually space to emerge. The paper was keen to run it, but it actually took some time.
Do you get the sense that they actually want to get their heads around this issue?
I think the journalists...
journalists in general, and they feel that they're not quite getting there?
I think, they understand it's a really big story. It's more money than any tax cut proposal has ever come forward. It's easily the biggest amount of money this government will spend or decide how to be allocated. But then they come to how do they actually assess competing claims, what Patrick was talking about. And this is where it's the work that Jeff Bertram and I have been doing is trying to actually put a set of accounts out that actually tells the numbers that are important. One, how much is it going to save? Who pays? When do they pay? What is the argument for subsidy to a particular company? If there is an argument for it, let's see it on paper and let's see it set out properly. At the moment, we have this scandal whereby billions and billions of dollars are being promised to major corporates when there is no proper assessment being done internally, none that's been shown publicly, and the public is left with their children paying the bill.
And yet we haven't heard it in those terms. I mean, particularly before, Patrick, before the agreement was announced, the thing we kept hearing was the cost per household. And I listened through an entire interview on Morning Report, Sean Plunkett talking to Nick Smith, and I still didn't understand what that measure was. Is it even a useful measure? What's it mean?
Well, I'm tending, in the reporting I'm doing on this, to ignore that transitional period through to 2013. It's a bit of a red herring. I mean, yes, they are easing the blow, if you like, on households. Although I thought it was interesting that they said, expect electricity prices to rise by 5%. So every electricity company CEO will have gone, ching ching, thank you. And, it's again the short-term nature of the way that politics tends to be structured. People are thinking about it in terms of through the next electoral cycle, and it's not going to hurt too much for now. I don't really have to think about that now.
Do you think perhaps, both of you, that we should have taken the carbon tax when that was on the table a little more seriously, because it did become pretty quickly the fart tax, didn't it?
Mm. That was only part of it. A carbon tax, let's be real clear, a carbon tax is a lot easier to track and trace, and who's paying and who's not. The great virtue of emissions trading scheme from government's perspective, is why it's become more popular, is it actually allows a vast degree of concealment. The ETS is actually off the Crown balance sheet, which is financial language for saying you don't see it when the government does a budget. It's actually an entirely separate currency that circulates separately, and all the comings and goings are extraordinarily hard to trace. That means these subsidies appear not as dollar figures, but as some weird thing called NZUs. That's not good democracy.
You mentioned before that there are people who do not even accept that this is happening. And you've got the likes of Ian Wishart. His book is selling very well. He's going and talking to groups of farmers. What kind of influence do you think that's having on the debate?
Increasingly negligible. You start from the top and you say that the governments of the world have signed up to a Kyoto agreement, at least the developed countries. New Zealand is not planning to duck out on that agreement. We have a binding contract, therefore we have to deliver on it. But I think more to the point, what you're seeing increasingly is that the science community and the political community is coming together in a way that everybody says we should at very least do what we can as an insurance risk for now, even those who don't fully support it. And the science really is becoming, frankly, a great deal more scary than it is becoming any sense that we might be let out.
To give the government its due, 10 days, 12 days ago, I wasn't confident they would necessarily even put agriculture into the scheme, let alone just knock it back to 2015. We had the Federated Farmers dairy spokesman was at the Labour Party conference saying, don't impose this until 2043. Thank you very much, because that's how long it'll take us to get ready.
And they've got a very easy entry to it from 2015.
Yeah, well, early doing's counting at that stage. So to that extent, we are at least heading in somewhat in the direction of trying to be responsible about what we have to do.
Remember, of course, that agriculture has been put out 2 years by this one. That's 2 elections away, and it may be put out another 2 years. So it's notionally included, but it's half of our emissions, and it's actually, contrary to popular myth, it's the place where we actually have the greatest opportunity to make economic savings.
And I get the impression that this ETS is not set in stone and it's going to be a moving target. And I'm sure we'll get both of you back at some point as well. Patrick Smelly and Simon Terry, thank you very much. And after the break, she's a hard road for women in politics.